me just turn this over to Andrew to walk through what's in front of us and explain where we are in the process.
Great, thank you, Mayor. Andrew Scott, City Budget Director, and we do have a large table today. We thought the citizen advisors may show up, but we may have exhausted them through the budget work sessions a couple of weeks ago. So I will quickly walk through the city's FY 2014-15 spring bump and sort of all the different categories. And again, we mostly focus on general fund, but we will talk a little bit about some of the non-general fund issues as well. The spring bump is when bureaus report on their financial and program performance, and they also request any budget adjustments that they need before the end of the fiscal year. And generally, those categories that those fall into, there are compensation set-aside requests, there are new requests from contingency, if there is any available, program carryover requests, so dollars that the Bureau is asking to carry over from this year to next fiscal year, and then technical adjustments. What you should have then in front of you is exhibit number 4, also known as the F1 report. This is the general fund reconciliation, and this is reflective of the mayor's decisions in terms of the spring bump. So again, we will be, today's the council work session. Next week, next Wednesday, council's going to have the hearing and vote on the bump, and so we'll be filing on Thursday. So again, what you have in front of you here is the mayor's proposed decisions. What you previously got from us last week were the city budget office recommendations that came in a packet to your office. As we go through these different categories, again, I'll just talk a little bit about what it is and what's being requested. In compensation set aside, just as a reminder, I know you all know, but in case anyone's watching at home, the city takes a portion of a bureau's personnel services budget every year and budgets that separately. So the portion related to cost of living increases and benefit increases is budgeted separately. Bureaus then throughout the year monitor their personnel spending. If they've been fully staffed throughout the year, then they come in the spring bump and request that compensation set aside, and it is generally recommended and granted. However, a lot of bureaus, just through normal vacancy savings throughout the year, are able to actually cover those costs, and so then that money would then fall to balance and is available to council next year as a one-time expenditure. Bureaus requested, so in compensation set aside, there's $8.25 million that was set aside this year. Bureaus have requested just under $6 million of that funding, and the city budget office recommended $5.9 million. 2 small adjustments. One of those adjustments in the Bureau of Emergency Communications, again, sort of reflecting an earlier transfer that BOEC made out of personal services into external materials and services, and when a bureau does that, we generally reduce that from their compensation set aside if they come in and request that. And then a small adjustment in the Office of Youth Violence Prevention, again, noting that we think the mayor's office has sufficient funding to cover that when we look at projections through the end of the year. Any questions on the compensation set aside? The next thing I'll talk about then is general fund contingency, and you'll see this category here on the exhibit 4 of mid-year reductions. Contingency coming into the spring bump, the unrestricted contingency was $852,000. Good news is that we're getting about $1.4 million back from bureaus. This is not an every year occurrence, and I'll go through the reasons for that this year. The Bureau of Emergency Communications is returning $411,000 to the general fund. This actually is a normal thing in the spring bump, since most of their funding comes from general fund. Once they've closed their books through the CAFR process, they then return any general fund underspending back to the general fund. The Transportation Bureau is returning $230,000 of underspending from the Jasmine Block project savings. That project came in under budget, so they're returning the general fund portion that had.
Could you repeat that, please?
Yes, it came in under budget, so they're returning $230,000 to the general fund. We are getting $24,500 back in campaign finance fund refund. This is back from the Golovin campaign, and again, a settlement, I believe, with Emily Boyles, and the total settlement was in the $70,000 range. Most of those funds are going back to the bureaus that had paid into that fund, but this is the general fund portion of that settlement. That fund is closed, so we went ahead and just sent those dollars back to the bureaus that would have paid them when that fund was still open. And then finally, the OMF revenue division is returning street fee funds, $724,000 to implement a street fee, since that is on hold for the time being. So that's $1.4 million being added back into contingency. And so assuming those resources, the total available in the spring bump unrestricted contingency is now $2.25 million. So again, this is good news and not something that happens every spring bump for sure. Moving on then down into the new requests, there were $1.1 million of new requests that came in from bureaus. Just as a reminder, the City Budget Office, we go through and review bureau requests. We do set a pretty high bar, particularly on contingency requests and particularly in the spring bump. We only recommend requests that are one-time, unforeseen, urgent, fully developed, and unlikely to be absorbed in existing bureau budgets. And so the two things that we recommended in this spring bump, one of them was reimbursing providers for severe weather expenses. It's about 6 items down. And $173,000, 478 request. We did recommend it at $68,478 after talking to the Housing Bureau. Those were the actual expenses for keeping the shelters open. I think the request was made at what the maximum might have been, but the actual expenses were $68,000, so that's what we recommended. And then the very last item, membership and dues. This is for a membership to CEOs for cities, $1,500, and the membership and dues special appropriations generally does not have enough funding, so we wanted to add that $1,500 to make sure that was covered. Those were the only two things that the City Budget Office recommended. And actually with that, Mayor, maybe I'll turn it over to you to talk a little bit about some of the things that you've added in your proposed bump.
Let me explicate that a little further in terms of my thinking. I mean, those 3 tests, you know, are these one-time, unforeseen, and unlikely to be absorbed. I take that largely to heart in terms of where I call balls and strikes on this set of proposals. I mean, another way to state that is, in a little more colloquial ways, do we have to spend this money right now, as opposed to can we ask a bureau to absorb it? Is it better considered in the upcoming general fund budget requests for the FY 15-16 budget? So some rationale behind some of these items. The single dwelling and development code project, I think we all feel an urgency to get started on that. They cannot issue the RFP if there's no funds identified, so they can't even start that process if we don't budget something now. The streetcar system improvements, there is a request from PBOT, which I really support, to spend a little bit of money on making some streetcar improvements. It's actually about double this amount, and that is changing 10th and 11th Avenue to right turn only except for streetcar, and making some signal improvements so that it runs faster. And the time to do that is right before the loop opens, which happens September 12th. So some of that work can be done in the next couple of months, and some of it can be done in July and August. But again, they can't start on that work unless they have some funding now. So it seemed reasonable, particularly since they were returning some unspent funds in almost the same amount that we get them started on that.
Can I just ask a procedural question of Andrew? Andrew, we have your spring supplemental budget report where you sort of are Dr. No on a lot of the things that are here.
That's his job. That's his job.
And that's your job. But what does it mean if there's a 0 at bureau request and there's money in the mayor's proposed?
That just means the request didn't come from the Bureau, that it was something that the mayor and his proposed has added. So again, on the streetcar system improvements, that is not a request that came from the Transportation Bureau, but I think, again, as I think the mayor's talking about the $230,000 back from the Jasmine block, combined with sort of the discussions about whether to fund these as part of the 15-16 budget, led the addition of that package.
So the bureau request category is exclusive of whatever you thought of the request?
Yes, correct. There's no judgment on the bureau request, right? That's right.
Yeah. The next two, the women's shelter capacity and the veterans assistance, are part of our Home for Everyone partnership. The county has actually has already approved. I think it's $370,000. Yeah, April 9th. They approved a budget modification of $370,000 to do their part of this partnership. So this is our side of that deal. the decorative fountains capital repairs, there's a much larger request in the FY 15-16 budget for that to get properly funded now that it's been transferred from water to parks. But this is capital repairs that I understand are needed sooner rather than later.
If I might just add to that, the challenge is that the ownership has not been transferred from water to parks. The maintenance has been. So that's a policy discussion that we need to have as to how are we going to manage the ownership and eventual replacement of the fountains.
Be careful what you own.
Well, by the way, that's
No,
the,
I'm teasing.
that's the Uber business model. We're just using it in water. We've
Stop.
shifted the cost to others and retain the asset.
Nice job.
Cute. Then the off-road cycling master plan, this is an effort to get this started again sooner rather than later. So I think it would be wise to do that given the strong community interest in starting it sooner rather than later. So that's the rationale behind the proposals I've made. Again, departing slightly from what the CBO came up with for those reasons in those cases.
Andrew, would you remind us, just as we have this in our head as we're going through, net of all the recommendations from the mayor, what's the ending fund balance in our reserves?
Contingency.
Contingency.
Yeah, assuming the decisions on that are before you right now, contingency would end up at $1 million.
$1 million, yeah, almost even.
Almost even.
Okay.
Yeah, so it would be higher than what we went into the fall bump with because of those resources that are coming back. That's right.
So thoughts, suggestions, recommendations, we'll have this in front of us next week. So time to talk about these items.
And if you want, I can just finish off quickly and then come back to the commissioner concerns. The program carryover requests, again, these are generally pretty straightforward. These are funds that bureaus, again, weren't able to fully expend this year, and so they're asking to carry them over, generally for the same project. The only thing we tend to look at here is whether a bureau has an ongoing appropriation for a project. So, say for instance, they have $100,000 to provide some program, they only spend $90,000 of it has to carry over. Generally, that's a carryover that won't be recommended because they have another $100,000 the next year. But again, if it's for a specific project, it generally does get carried over. And $4.6 million was requested. And again, in the mayor's proposed, it's about 5.1, a little less than $5.1 million. That reflects the addition of the off-road cycling master plan and the single dwelling development code, which again are being appropriated so they can get to work on those things, but the bulk of which will be carried over into the next fiscal year. And I don't think there were any other issues.
It was the civil rights program.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. And then one small change in the Office of Equity and Human Rights. Again, that's an ongoing. They requested $7,500 for the civil rights program, but again, it's an ongoing appropriation, which is why we recommended against that. And then the final category was somewhat lengthy, technical adjustments. These are generally just internal transfers that net out to zero within a particular bureau. There are just, I will note a couple, and so for the most part, recommended as submitted. There are a couple changes though that we do recommend. One of which is on, the OMF.
It's the very last line.
It's the very
on
last
page
one,
2.
yeah, thank you, on page 2. The OMF general fund budget reduction to fund the SAP travel module. OMF wanted to take $100,000 of their general fund underspending and purchase a travel module for SAP, which they believe is needed. We recommended against that. We feel like the SAP cost should be billed out through the normal process and not use general fund for that, which means some general fund would still need to go towards it, but again, bill it out through their normal IA and let that general fund savings fall to balance. And then there is a parks package in here. Where was that one, Claudio?
Well, it's reflected in 2 places. One in Parks, close to the bottom of page 3. There was that. It was originally requested at $98,000. That was per the ordinance. The ordinance allowed for a transfer from contingency up to $98,000, and it was identified that the IGA only required $30,000 this year. So.
And I think those were the only 2
Yeah, I think so.
adjustments.
Andy, what are all these nickel and dime things on the campaign fund refund? $10, $7,000. What? Just generally, what's that?
Yeah, that's as Andrew mentioned earlier. and the general fund is receiving a portion of that reimbursement for the campaign finance, from the campaign finance fund, but the other funds are also receiving there. So that money was received into the general fund and needs to be transferred out to the bureaus. So that's all that they all net to zero. But they just need to show up there as going out of the general fund. There are several other flavors of adjustments there that also innovation fund awards are allocated out. And then there are a couple of special appropriations that are moved to bureaus, and I think that is
Yeah, I
it.
see that the Water Bureau is getting back $7,627. So we'll be filing a supplemental rate increase, a recommendation to the council.
Rate decrease, yeah.
0.00001% decline.
Yeah. And then finally, I'll
Can
just,
I ask a question? There's the third line from the bottom of page 2, reduce cash transfer from general fund for Sears building, CIP. Can you explain? The third line from the bottom of page 2. 1.2 million. roughly.
That one.
give me just 1 second. Yeah, no, I see it in there. I'm looking at my cheat sheet to remind me what that is. And actually, if OMF's in the room and would like to come
Yeah,
up
I'm
and
just
talk
trying to
about
understand
that,
what's actually happening in this item.
Oh, I think I know this one.
Thanks, Aaron, bailing us out.
Good morning. Is this on? Good morning, Aaron Beck, OMF Business Operations. When the cash transfer was initially set up from the general fund for the Sears project for the fueling stations, it was going to our facility services fund. Well, after working with the project team, we decided that that really should go to the fleet fund, because the fleet fund will own the tank at the Sears facility, and along with all of the other tanks that are being done. So to best capitalize it into the fleet fund, we're changing the cash transfer from going to facilities to fleet.
So the 1.2 million is still going to be spent?
Yes.
at
It's
the
just
Sears
getting
building.
spent in a different place. Yeah.
And you can actually see the other side of that at the very top of page 3. So again, it nets to zero, the 1.2 million moving from one fund to the other. So thank you, Aaron. And then I will just wrap up talking briefly about the non-general fund changes, because there are a few just significant things. I'll just hit these again. This report focuses on the general fund, but some of the non-general fund changes that are in the bump that will be filed. The Parks Bureau is budgeting an additional $3 million in projected SDC revenues for the remainder of the current fiscal year, increasing projected revenues from about $9.7 million to $12.7 million. Bureau of Environmental Services is budgeting an additional $13 million in their rate stabilization fund balance, again, increasing that project balance to $43 million. The Bureau of Development Services is adding a total of 39 regular positions. These are positions that had originally been requested as part of the 15-16 budget process. We were able to move those up into the bump. These are fee-supported positions, and again, they want to get going as quickly as they can to hire those to meet the service demands of the Bureau of Development Services. Transportation Bureau is increasing the transfer to the Transportation Reserve Fund by $500,000 as part of an effort to achieve their overall reserve target. And then also Transportation is budgeting $4.5 million out of contingency to complete the Close the Loop project and complete the purchase of a new streetcar vehicle. And then finally, also in Transportation, $4.9 million moving out of contingency for the purchase of parking pay stations. And I think those are the major issues and position changes in this bump, a grand total of 47.2 regular positions. Again, the bulk of those being at Development Services, correct.
Questions? Follow-up concerns?
Thank you. First of all, I very much support starting the single dwelling development zone project. I think that's is an urgent need that we need to get started on. I also appreciate the decorative fountains repair money and the 2 housing S for the women's shelter year-round and the veterans housing assistance. Those are sorely needed, and I appreciate you putting those in. The Office of Neighborhood Involvement, the third bullet down under the new requests, the $4,735. If you turn to page 57 of the Office of City Budget Office's report, this was a promise that was made when transferring the Office of Equity and Human Rights position into the Office of Neighborhood Involvement. It involves different folks doing very similar work within ONI being paid different amounts because of the different classification within Office of Equity and Human Rights. So I do believe we should be funding this amount for this fiscal year and then supporting it as an ongoing request for next funding year in the budget, because that was what the agreement was.
Yeah, I think that the sense was on a couple of these, this one included that they could absorb it, not that the salary differential was inappropriate, but.
That's right, yeah, no, I think it was not I think the agreement, Commissioner Fritz is correct, was made, but both our projections and I believe the Bureau's projections showed that they'd be able to absorb that $4,700 in additional costs.
The challenge with a very small bureau like ONI is that they keep getting asked to absorb this, that, and the other, and so I would really appreciate, this is a relatively small amount out of the entire contingency, and signaling our intent to fund it would mean a lot to me, and I think to the folks who are working so hard there. There's another ONI request which somehow didn't get included in the requests, and that's for the marijuana position, which we had discussed when we did the marijuana tax proposal, and they really need $14,200 to start advertising that position now. As we all know, the rules are going into effect on July 1st, so waiting for the budget process is not sufficient.
So that was just the cost for starting the process of filling the position, not actual salary?
No, that's the salary for this
For the
this
first
fiscal year.
month or two.
Yeah.
What, I don't remember that one, Andrew.
We haven't seen that as a request from the Bureau.
I think it got lost in your office.
Okay, we'll find out.
I'm particularly concerned about the marijuana program, having had the issues with the tree code startup. I know that you need to have the staff on board, which brings me to my next request, which is the tree code implementation. We, as you know, put forward a proposal last year before last, for the amount of positions we thought we needed in order to run the tree code implementation in both parks and BDS. Council said try to make do with less, and we did, and it's not working. We need those 2 positions now, and we need them ongoing in the next budget. It's the folks at the Development Services who are answering the tree code line and giving the information about how to get your permits under the new system, and having 2 people doing that is just not adequate, and so we're asking to add positions there.
This 45,000 would represent making an ongoing commitment to additional positions, right?
Yes, and they are absolutely needed.
So that's, I mean, the question is, should that be done now, or should that be done should that be considered in the 15-16 budget, given that they are permanent? We're talking about permanent positions, right? So when do we do that? Do we do that now, or do we do that in the regular budget? That question runs through several of these issues, and I've generally fallen on the same side that Andrew and the staff have, which is if we're creating new ongoing positions, that's probably not the time to do that. Well,
The council agreed to implement the tree code, and so we've tried our very best to implement it with the lower level of funding that was allocated, and it's just not working. So, you know, it's April, and to ask the staff to hang on without relief until probably September, if it's approved in the budget, which I hope it will be, and I believe I have the support for. That's entirely over the summer, with people not being able to take vacations or sick days or anything, because there isn't relief staffing in the Development Services Center.
Mayor, might I just add that I've also heard from a lot of people that the staff capacity issue is getting in the way of us being an effective regulator. So the question that I think we should talk about beyond this hearing, because we can't make decisions today, it's a work session, is how likely is it we're going to create new positions? Because I think the exception to your rule would be, unless it's clear we're going to create ongoing funding for a position, and this is just bridge money. If that question's in doubt, let's begin to have that conversation. And then, but I generally agree with you that we should not create ongoing positions with in this proceeding unless it's clear that we're going to continue the funding in the regular budget. So I would welcome your views on that outside of this forum, because I also share Commissioner Fritz's concern that we're understaffed to meet the demand right now.
Just to add to that, I mean, if we're unable to provide good customer service on this new set of regulations, I think that is something of concern. I also think, though, and I've talked to Commissioner Fritz about this, that it would be nice as we're staffing up to also take a look at perhaps making some modifications to the tree code. Because, for example, I confess that I didn't realize that you have to have a permit to prune a branch that's more than 1/4 of an inch in diameter. And that seems a little extreme. So I hope that we take up some modifications in the near future too.
So absolutely, we'd love to do that. We need the staff to be able to do that. So it's a chicken and egg thing, but what we've done is we have this very complicated code that we're expecting people to get permits for tiny little branch prunings, and we need to both fix the regulations and we need to be able to answer the questions in the permit center, and it's not reasonable. We just can't do it. So I think that I'm kind of calling the question for the council. Do we support effective implementation of the tree code, or do you want us to pack it in? Thank you. My last one is about the off-road cycling master plan. I appreciate the intent of putting something on the table, and I realize my director, Michael Barte, said that the parks could do it earlier if it was funded. He also said that we would need additional staffing in order to be able to do that. So the request is no longer $350,000, it's adding a staff member. As you all know, we're implementing the Parks Bond. We're building 2 new parks in a Gateway. We're doing a huge amount of public outreach to implement the dozens of projects in the Parks Bond. And we just don't have the capacity to do something which, as you all know from reading the 2,000 emails in your inboxes, is going to generate a lot of interest citywide. So what I would like to suggest instead is that what we would have to do, if this is funded in the bump, we would have to ask to carry it over, because there's no way we can start doing the master plan this fiscal year. What I'd like to suggest, though, Mayor, I really appreciate the intent of demonstrating to the off-road cycling community that we are serious about addressing their concerns. There is a one-time request in the budget from Gateway Green to provide funds so that they get their matching funds from Metro. And that truly is a one-time thing that would be very significant if we were to give them this amount, or the amount that they asked for in the budget. It's part of the bump. It would help them in their fundraising, because there's a deadline for that fundraising.
Mayor,
I mean, as somebody who used to do a lot of master plans for local governments, there are 2 ways to do this. We can hire somebody in a short-term position and say, your job is to write the master plan. Or we can hire a consultant and say, your job is to write the master plan. But
it still requires
should not typically do both.
It requires the parks communications infrastructure to be able to help the consultants set up the meetings, do the public outreach, and we just don't have the capacity for that in this fiscal year.
I'd be interested in knowing what the additional cost is of the request. I will say that the communication we're getting on this issue is a little mixed. But we very much appreciate, Mayor, the strong support you've given Commissioner Fritz and me on the moratorium, because that has to be done in order to have something in place. And my own personal view is the sooner we do this study, the better, because then we'll have some better data to make some informed decisions. Doesn't mean people are going to agree or disagree with where we land on Riverview or any number of other options. But I appreciate that we're doing this sooner rather than later.
Okay, other items to flag or do further work on? Anybody else? Okay. Might be. Okay, so we've got some follow-up that I'll do with you individually about some of these items, but appreciate you raising this, Commissioner Fritz. Nobody else got anything for the good of the order? We may be done early. That won't be it will probably be the only time this week that I'll be able to say that.
We're rooting for you, Charlie. You're on a roll. Let's keep it going.